All right, so wrapping up the second part of our chapter here. And this portion of the lecture will talk about the digestion and absorption of proteins, the various functions that proteins perform in our body and in our cells, the dietary recommendations for proteins, and then a couple disease associations. So hopefully the digestion and absorption portion here is just review for you. So like with all of our macronutrients, there will be mechanical and chemical digestion. So mechanical digestion of proteins occurs first in the mouth. With chewing, we mechanically digest all of our food in the mouth, but then a majority of the mechanical digestion will start in the stomach. So the hydrochloric acid that we are pumping into our stomach is going to interrupt all of those hydrogen bonds and ionic bonds holding the protein into its more complex structures, its secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structure, essentially unraveling it into a long chain of amino acids with their bonds exposed. Right? And so this is called denaturing. So hydrochloric acid denatures proteins. So again, interrupts those bonds, exposing the individual amino acids with their neighboring pair. And so once they have been denatured, then chemical digestion of these proteins can occur. And we have this starting in the stomach and then finishing in the small intestine. So in the stomach, we are secreting an inactive enzyme called pepsinogen, which will activate in the presence of hydrochloric acid, creating pepsin. So again, pepsin's most efficient pH level, or its necessary pH to be active, is very, very acidic. And so when it's in the presence of hydrochloric acid, it is now active. And pepsin will start to break those bonds holding individual amino acids together. And this process will continue in the small intestine with proteases from our pancreas. And those proteases will complete any leftover digestion that needs to be done. So by the end of moving through the small intestine, all of our proteins should have been fully denatured and then broken down into either di or tripeptides, which would be 2 or 3 amino acids long, or individual amino acids themselves. And then we can absorb these smaller versions of proteins into our small intestine and then into the circulatory system. Okay. So here's just a quick review of all of those things. So we get some mechanical digestion in the mouth. We then have both mechanical and chemical digestion happening in the stomach. Again, hydrochloric acid denatures proteins. Pepsin chemically digests them. So it is an enzyme that breaks the bonds between individual amino acids. Then in the small intestine, the rest of chemical digestion will wrap up. So the proteases from our pancreas will finish breaking apart any leftover chains of amino acids until we're left with just dipeptides, tripeptides, and individual amino acids. So again, kind of the reverse order of what we were looking at earlier. So quaternary, tertiary, and secondary structures will be interrupted. They will denature the protein all the way back to a linear chain, and then the enzymes will break these individual bonds. All right. So this is just a review of what I was saying. You take a second to think about it, pause here. Hopefully, you know that the action of hydrochloric acid on our proteins results in denaturation. This question is really just here to drive in that new term, denaturation. To denature a protein is to interrupt its more complex structure, leaving us with a long chain of amino acids. Okay, so once our proteins have been digested, broken down to their tripeptides, dipeptides, and individual amino acids, we then need to get them into our small intestine, into the cells of our small intestine, and then into our capillaries, where they will be taken to the liver. And so both versions of transport, getting into the intestinal lining cells and then out of those intestinal lining cells, are types of active transport. Coming out of the small intestine, out of the space in our small intestine into these lining cells will be done through a method of active transport called co-transport. So this is using a membrane protein that is going to require the input of energy. It is active, but instead of using ATP as an energy source, we use the natural energy that results from the diffusion of other molecules like sodium here. So sodium is going to be traveling with its concentration gradient. It will naturally want to diffuse into the cell. As it moves through this protein, that generates enough energy for the protein to also bring in some of these small amino acids and tripeptides and dipeptides. So again, the energy for this transport comes from the movement of sodium, and that allows for us to move these small proteins out of the lining or out of the inside of our small intestine and into the intestinal lining cells. Then we need to get the protein out of those lining cells and into our capillaries, and that will take the input of ATP to provide the energy necessary to move this protein across the membrane and into the capillaries. Okay. And so once they're into the capillaries, these proteins will be taken to the liver first, and then the liver will modify, move them, release them, send them somewhere else. Okay. So like I mentioned in the last section, proteins are arguably the most important macromolecule in our cells because they essentially take care of all of the functions. They control everything that's going on based on the instructions from our DNA. So these functions can be broken down to all these categories that we'll talk about here. So they're very important for cell growth, repair, and maintenance. They build the cytoskeleton of our cells. They make up all the proteins that will transfer molecules in and out of our cells, and even the proteins that carry these molecules throughout our cells. They make enzymes, or a lot of proteins are enzymes, which control which chemical reactions are happening in a space. So they increase the rates of specific cellular reactions. Proteins can make up hormones. So we have lipid-based hormones like testosterone and estrogen, and we have protein-based hormones like insulin and glucagon. These are our long-range chemical messengers. They play a role in maintaining and balancing the fluid inside and outside of our cells. They can contribute to the pH of different environments. They are what act as these antibodies, so the immune system, or proteins in our immune system cells that recognize invaders and then ultimately help us kill them and remove them. And then lastly, proteins can be used as essentially our last source of energy. Okay, so cellular maintenance. So they play a very, very important role, a very major role in our cells' abilities to grow, repair, and maintain themselves. So we use proteins to make lots of long fibrous structures that end up creating the skeleton of the cell, the cytoskeleton. So these are structural protein filaments that give cells their shape. And we can extend those protein filaments through the plasma membrane in order to create other structures like the microvilli that we talked about and our small intestines having to increase surface area, right? These are just protein fibers that have pushed the cell membrane into creating those tiny ridges. Structural filaments make up the extracellular matrix of our bones and cartilage, and the contractile fibers of muscles. So proteins are playing a role in all of our different tissue types as far as giving that cell structure and allowing it to perform the function that cell is necessary for. We have proteins embedded in all of our cell membranes in order to help transport the molecules that cannot simply diffuse across the membrane. So these channel proteins will help move in large hydrophilic molecules into the cell or out of the cell, and can regulate even the passage of others that do diffuse across the membrane. And then we have carrier proteins, which literally pick up and move other molecules. I might add a video that you guys can watch. It's not required for you to learn about it, but watching these carrier proteins and how they travel across these other structural filaments in a cell is really, really cool to see, because it's almost like it's walking. They essentially have two little leg parts that bond to the protein fiber at each end, and they essentially flip those legs over and over, carrying whatever molecule or load they have atop them. So it's like a guy with a backpack kind of hiking up this long vine, which is really cool. So I think I will upload that video for you guys. So check that out when you can. Right. We talked about transport proteins in various different examples. Here is our sodium-potassium pumps, which is what drives the ability of our neurons to transfer signals, and the ability of our muscle cells to receive those signals and transfer signals back, etc. But these are, again, transport proteins embedded in the membrane that control the movements of sodium and potassium into and outside of our cells. So for something small, like an individual mineral, like sodium, right, which we have in red here, and then potassium, which we have in blue, these molecules can just simply diffuse across the membrane, but we would use proteins to move them against their concentration gradient. which can force a particular charge to the internal or outer environment around our cells, which is what drives the electrical signaling that our neurons use. Okay. Lots of proteins function as enzymes, which again, you've seen pictures of this before, but enzymes have a very specific shape and chemical composition that allows them to bond with typically one or two specific molecules. So you can see the shape of this enzyme has two regions that perfectly fit this disaccharide here. They then, make it much easier to contribute energy, to break those bonds, and then they will release the individual substrates as a result. Enzymes can also function in the opposite direction. So a similar looking enzyme might bond or would have these shaped areas to bond with each of these monosaccharides, and then can help build the bond holding them together and then release a full disaccharide as a result. Okay, so enzymes control the breakdown and buildup of molecules. And then we use proteins as hormones. Again, these long-range chemical messengers like insulin and glucagon. Okay, fluid balance. So the presence of proteins in different environments inside and outside of our cells is what helps control the concentration of other solutes. So anything that is dissolved in those aqueous environments. And so if we, depending on the maintenance of those protein concentrations, so for instance, if the concentration of proteins in our blood becomes too low, then a lot of the plasma and fluid that would typically be traveling through our body will end up staying outside of the cells in that particular area, which will lead to a buildup of fluids in that area in order to balance out the concentration. And that is what produces an edema. So what we have here is simply just a buildup of the plasma that should be traveling through our vascular system, but instead is stuck outside of our cells in this intercellular space, creating this large buildup of fluid that we call an edema. Okay. Proteins also contribute to the pH balance of the environments that they're in. So most proteins are negatively charged and have a lot of negatively charged side chains. And so they can interact with free hydrogen ions, which would reduce the acidity of an environment. So they can help prevent acidosis, which is the buildup of acid in the blood and in the gut, by attracting these positively charged hydrogen ions and thus reducing or increasing the pH, making it more basic, keeping it from getting too acidic. And in the same way, it can function in the opposite by releasing free hydrogen ions whenever the blood becomes too basic or alkaline. So it's a great buffer, and very similar to how water acts as a buffer, and that water can both increase acidity and decrease acidity. Proteins can do the same thing. They can increase acidity by releasing hydrogen ions, and they can decrease acidity by bonding with those hydrogen ions. Okay. Proteins are also what make up antibodies. So this is somewhat general knowledge. You've probably heard of antibodies and the relation to our immune system, right? But these are specific proteins that are there to recognize invaders. So whenever our body has experienced a bacterial infection, a virus, a fungal infection, right? All of those different organisms carry proteins that our cells don't make. And so our cells will recognize those proteins as foreign. We will develop antibodies, so proteins that are perfectly shaped and have a chemical composition to bond with those foreign proteins. And that way we will have them traveling through our blood regularly. And so the next time that invader gets back into our body, we will recognize it immediately and kill it before it can propagate, multiply, and become a real problem. So let me just show you this image first, right? So here's an immune cell with an antibody sticking out of it. That antibody would recognize proteins from an invader, like a virus that it has experienced before. It would take that virus to a other immune cell, which would be responsible for breaking it down and destroying it, essentially. So we have macrophage cells that respond to these antibodies bonding to an invader, and those macrophages will absorb the invader and destroy it. And so this is why vaccines are really, really important. Your body will only make antibodies for a particular invader if it knows it exists. right? We can't just create antibodies for every possible protein that exists and expect that to be effective and efficient. So in order for your immune system to create antibodies against a specific virus or a specific bacteria, it must have been exposed to that invader at some point. And so most immunizations, vaccines, are giving your body a small amount of that protein or a small amount of RNA, which will produce this protein, so that our body is now exposed to that foreign protein. It will start producing antibodies against that foreign protein. And so the next time that virus tries to enter your body, your blood is there, it will recognize it, and your immune system will act on it before it can propagate to dangerous levels. So everybody, please get your vaccines. They're very, very important. All right. And the last function of proteins in our body here would be as an energy source. So we really only convert proteins into energy when we are super low on access to carbohydrates and lipids. Right? Our body will prefer those two sources over proteins. But if we do run out of stored glycogen and we do run out of stored fatty acids, we can start breaking down proteins and use their pieces to make more glucose or make more fatty acids. Right? So that's that process of gluconeogenesis. Right? So creating or the birth of new glucose, we essentially just break down amino acids, use what is left over as a usable substrate to create more glucose. So in this way, throughout a day, typically the human body will use proteins in order to contribute to 10 to 15% of their daily energy, again, using the amino acid in order to make other glucose or fatty acid molecules. But most of the energy that you're using throughout the day is coming from glucose and fatty acids that you have consumed and stored. Okay. And so unlike carbohydrates and lipids, we do not have a special function to store extra amino acids. Right? Glucose can be turned into glycogen and stored for later. Fatty acids can be taken to adipose tissue and stored for later, but we don't have something like that for proteins. So any of our excess proteins are going to be broken down, and that is going to release excess nitrogen into our bloodstream, which can end up putting stress on our kidneys, because our kidneys are the organ responsible for filtering out that nitrogen. And so this is something that can lead to potential issues from eating too much protein, having too many amino acids free traveling through your circulatory system, because your body will simply use up whatever it needs to make a protein, and then whatever is left is going to be broken down and converted into a different molecule, releasing the leftover nitrogen to be filtered out by your kidneys. Okay. So determining how much protein you should eat is going to differ based on the activity level of that individual, the age, general health status, as far as how many amino acids your body is going to need in order to build the proteins that it's using. And so some examples of the population who would need more protein would be any individual that is growing, right? So children and adolescents that are building more and more cells, building more and more tissue, they need more and more protein, because protein makes up a lot of these structural components of our cells. Any pregnant or lactating women, so same concept here. A pregnant woman is building a new body inside their uterus, so they need lots of protein to help build those cells. Through lactation, you are losing those nutrients and resources through your milk, and so you need more protein to keep up with that and contribute that to the growing child. Athletes who are stressing and building more and more muscle cells are going to need more protein. And then vegetarians or vegans typically are being recommended a higher concentration of protein in their diet, because again, there are no plant-based complete proteins. And so this higher recommendation for protein is to try to ensure that you're achieving mutual supplementation, that you are getting 2 or more sources of protein that will create a complete protein. Will give you all 9 essential amino acids. So in general, the recommendation is that you should consume 0.8 grams per 1 kilogram of body weight. So converting that to pounds, that's about 0.38 grams per pound. And so if you know how much you weigh, you can simply use that to calculate exactly how much protein you would be recommended from this. And so in general, the contribution to the total amount of energy that you're getting from your food throughout the day has a pretty wide range. So from 10% to 35%, again, because of all these other variables that contribute to how much protein your body needs. So for instance, different types of athletes. So incorporating a exercise routine into your daily regimen, and depending on whether or not you eat meat, is going to contribute to how much protein you should be consuming. So for most adults, it is that general 0.8 grams per kilogram as far as the DRI, the recommended amount of protein you should be consuming. But if you are an endurance athlete, so the type of exercise that you participate in is a moderate intensity over a long period of time. You don't need necessarily as much protein as a strength athlete, but you do need a higher amount than a non-active individual. Right? Your muscles are still being used, still being stressed, and will still need to rebuild themselves. So you do need a higher amount of protein than just a typical adult, but not as much as a strength athlete. A strength athlete, which is doing high intensity exercise over a short period, is going to be putting excess stress on their muscles, and so would need a higher amount of protein in order to help rebuild and repair those muscles that are used to move heavy weights, right? And to be explosive, to provide a lot of force in one motion. So in general, if you're active, you need more protein than if you're not active. If you are a strength athlete, you need more protein compared to an endurance athlete. And then lastly, vegetarians are recommended to consume more protein than non-vegetarians. So if you're not consuming meat as a regular part of your diet, it's recommended that you try to consume more protein so that you are reaching that mutual supplementation goal more often. So if we compare our non-vegetarian endurance athlete to our vegetarian endurance athlete, it's just a slightly smaller increase, and same for our strength athletes. So again, if you're active, you need more protein than if you're not active. Strength athletes need more protein than endurance athletes, and then vegetarians or vegans need more protein than non-vegetarians or vegans. Or I guess I'm saying need here, and that's not necessarily the correct word. You're recommended to consume more. Now we'll look at the risks that come with consuming too much or too little protein and the effects that would have on our body. So the risk of consuming too much protein stems from the effects that proteins have on the acidity or pH of our circulatory system, and then the excess nitrogen that would be released when we have too much protein and start breaking down our amino acids. So for instance, too much protein could lead to potential bone loss. So with the proteins traveling through our blood in excess, that's going to make our blood really acidic, or potentially really alkaline, depending on the type of protein. But if it is making our blood too acidic, our bones will start to break down the stored calcium that creates our bones in order to release that calcium to our blood and help buffer it down. So too much proteins traveling throughout the blood could cause your bones to start to break apart and lead to bone loss, the thinning of the bones, not necessarily breaking bones, but the thinning of those bones, right, as they release calcium into the blood. And calcium is used for lots of other things. Our bones regularly break down and then re-add calcium. So our skeletal system is basically storage for calcium in that way. But we use calcium to help with our muscles in order to transmit signals, help with other neurons and hormones. Calcium is used for lots of things. And so it's not rare that our bones are releasing calcium, but this is just one instance where we might be inducing that by eating too much protein. Another possible risk by consuming too much protein is increasing the risk of kidney disease. So again, we can't store extra amino acids. So if we have extras, they're going to be broken apart and turned into glucose or fatty acids. And then that extra nitrogen that was on the amine group will be released into the blood and will eventually be filtered out by the kidneys. And so the more excess amino acids we have, the more nitrogen that will be in our blood, and the more stress that will be on our kidneys in order to filter them out, which could lead to kidney disease. So again, these are both just possible impacts. There's not a whole lot of research supporting a significant risk by overconsuming protein. Okay, but where you would be reaching those levels or be at risk of reaching those high levels of excess amino acids would be coming from amino acid supplements. So these are really common supplements, especially for athletes or people that regularly work out. Right? You have your protein powders, and then your amino acid supplements themselves, either individual amino acid supplements or branch chain amino acid supplements. And so let's just talk about the examples I have on the slide here before I expand on it. So supplements that provide high concentrations of individual amino acids are not useful to the body. Our body is not able to handle large concentrations of individual amino acids. Our systems are set up to break down and utilize large complex chains of proteins in order to get a variety of amino acids. So any supplement that is just giving you really high concentrations of specific amino acids is more likely to negatively impact your system than it is to benefit. And you risk reaching those toxic levels because we have too much of them. Right? Supplements that provide chains of amino acids, so branch chain amino acid supplements, can be useful. And so this, along with like protein powder, these are really only useful if you're not eating a varied diet, if you're not reaching your dietary recommendations for different various sources of food. Right? But if you're following some of the other general guidelines we talked about, then taking protein supplements is unnecessary, completely unnecessary. So most research has shown that there's little to no significant benefit from utilizing any protein supplement compared to individuals who are just consuming a varied and diverse diet. So even in athletes, right? So even in someone who is a strength athlete, works out regularly, or works out in excess all the time, and so it's putting a lot of strain on their muscle, it does not benefit them more to drink protein powder or take amino acid supplements compared to that same athlete just eating a healthy diet. Right? So use at your own risk, right? So again, it's really only useful if you're getting chains of amino acids, and really only useful as a substitute for just eating protein. So if you're not getting enough protein from what you eat regularly, sure, drink some protein powder or take an amino acid supplement. Other than that, it doesn't really do much. Okay. So just a bit more on vegetarian diets. I'm going to try not to go into too much detail, especially for my face-to-face classes. We have some groups working on a group project that'll be analyzing vegetarian diets. But just some basic info here, since this is the main group of people who need to think about their protein consumption. So eating vegetarian can be healthy in lots of ways, or really helpful in lots of ways. So it is associated with a lower intake of total energy. So it's much harder to overeat and overconsume on a vegetarian or vegan diet. It's associated with lower blood pressure and reduced risk of heart disease because of the types of lipoproteins that come from unsaturated fats. Right? So vegan and vegetarian plant-sourced foods are more likely to carry those long-chain polyunsaturated fats, and thus are more likely to produce high-density lipoproteins. And so those help clear out our arterial walls and keep our circulatory system healthy. They've been associated with the reduced risk of some types of cancer and fewer digestive problems than have been associated with eating meat. However, there are also challenges with eating vegetarian. And no, I don't just mean making food taste good, though that is my biggest challenge when trying to eat vegetarian or vegan. I don't know how to cook well enough to utilize these well and make food taste good. But the challenges I'm talking about here are related to the impact on our body. So when you're eating strictly vegetarian food sources or plant-based food sources, you are getting lower amounts of some vitamins and minerals compared to an omnivorous diet that it does include meat, especially like fat-soluble vitamins, which are common in higher concentrations from meat sources than they are from plants. Plant-based proteins are considered lower quality. Again, this is just because they are incomplete proteins. There are no complete plant-based sources of protein, so you have to consume 2 or more sources to get all 9 essential amino acids. And that's really the main thing. So if you do eat a vegetarian or vegan diet, make sure you are including complementary proteins so that you are achieving mutual supplementation. You are getting all 9 essential amino acids. And soy is great because it contains, I think, at least 7, but maybe even 8 of those essential amino acids, and is really, really high in protein content. Okay, and so the last portion here is just looking at 2 common disease associations related to protein malnutrition, so not getting enough. So both of these diseases are considered parts of protein energy malnutrition. So these are disorders caused by inadequate intake of protein and energy. And so we have kwashiorkor and marasmus. So marasmus as the severe wasting of muscle tissue that can result in stunted growth overall, stunted brain development and nervous system development, and anemia. And so that is changing the shape of your blood cells. And this stems from a deficiency of all macronutrients, but is also strongly related to a deficiency in protein specifically. And so marasmus, again, looks more like this. Kwashiorkor is where we get some of that bloat or edema around our gastric system. So kwashiorkor is also muscle wasting, but also includes some bloating. And so this is really common, and both of these, I guess, are really common in countries that are like developing or have recently undergone like terrible war and are being mistreated in general. So areas that don't have access to a diverse amount of food would be suffering from malnutrition. They're not getting all the nutrients that the body needs. So symptoms of kwashiorkor are weight loss and muscle wasting, that edema, which is that bloating that you see in the belly, and then inhibited growth and development, similar to marasmus. But kwashiorkor is more strongly associated with a deficiency in protein specifically. So even if they're being given aid in the form of like bread as an energy source, and they're not getting any protein energy source, they still risk the development of kwashiorkor. So that is it for this week's lecture content. As always, please reach out if you have any questions or concerns, and I will see you guys in the next one.